Glee.
Well, order, and welcome to our second Treasury Committee session for our inquiry into whether the UK's Russian financial sanctions are working. We're going to hear from two panels of witnesses today, and on our first panel, can I ask our first witness to introduce himself, please?
Hello, everybody. My name is Bill Browder. I'm the CEO of Hermitage Capital Management and head of the Global Magnitsky Justice Campaign. Since the murder of my lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, in Russia in 2009, I've taken on the mission to get justice, and that has resulted in the passage of something named after him called the Magnitsky Act, which was passed in the United States in 2012, passed in Canada in 2017, here in the UK in 2018, in the EU 2020, and Australia in 2021. There are now 35 countries in the world that have operating Magnitsky Acts, and through this process I've become an expert on sanctions, on implementation of sanctions, and it's led me to all sorts of discussions around the world with different policymakers, government officials, and others. I'm pleased to be here today to address this very important issue of whether sanctions are working or not and what we can do to improve them.
Thank you very much, and I know that you have absolutely worked relentlessly on this and campaigned relentlessly and published a book on it, which I've had the pleasure of reading. And I think that, clearly since the Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the lessons that have been learned through implementing the Magnitsky sanctions are now very valuable in terms of seeing what needs to change for this much wider crime that's been undertaken. And I wondered if you could start, Mr. Browder, by just saying what you would like to see change in terms of the current regime that the UK is operating in response to the invasion of Ukraine.
First of all, I want to say something really important and clear, which is that Putin has stated on a number of occasions that sanctions aren't working. He says sanctions aren't working. Look how great we're doing. We have great economic statistics. Everything is fine. Therefore, why are you suffering yourselves from having these sanctions because they're hurting you? And so the first thing I want to say is that sanctions are crippling Russia, and I think this is really important. And I want to back up and say that the numbers that you receive about the quote success of the Russian economy come from a country. The Russian State Statistics Committee produces those numbers. The Russians lie in every other area. I don't see any reason why we should believe those numbers coming out of Russia. And let me just go through in a very broad level the effects of sanctions, just so that it's all clear and laid out. A week after the war started, the West froze more than $300 billion of Russian central bank reserves. They had $650 billion in their literal war chest. That was Putin's war chest. One of the reasons he felt confident going to war was that he had $650 billion of central bank reserves. In one fell swoop, we immobilized that money, and that money is no longer usable. We've also sanctioned, I believe at this stage, out of 98 oligarchs who are listed by the U.S. government as being sort of influential oligarchs, here in the UK, I believe we've sanctioned 57 of them, and their money has effectively been immobilized anywhere they have that money. And that number could be in the order of magnitude of the central bank reserves of money abroad that they can't access. We have also said or sanctioned the foreign borrowing capability of the Russian government and Russian companies. And they were borrowing many tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars before all this thing happened. That's gone to zero. About 1,500 Western companies have retreated from Russia, and Russia has gone from plus 40 billion of foreign direct investment before the war started to minus 40 billion. So there's been an $80 billion swing. The big loophole, though, is the sale of oil. Russia continues to sell oil, not to us. The amounts of oil directly sold to us has gone down by 80+%. But whatever oil that used to be sold to us is now being sold to India, China, and Turkey. And the problem is, there's two problems. One is that they continue to get a lot of money from that oil, somewhere between $500 million and $1 billion a day. And second, the oil that's being sold to refineries in India, China, and Turkey, some of that oil comes back this way. About $23 billion worth of oil refined products is being sold back in this direction to the EU. And I believe that last year the UK bought $2.2 billion worth of that refined product. And so as long as Russia can sell the oil, Russia can use that hard currency to buy weapons, and they can use those weapons to kill Ukrainians. And so on one side, we're funding either or directly or indirectly, we're funding Russia to conduct their war. And on the other side, we're then funding the Ukrainians to fight back. And something has to give. And what Putin is hoping is going to give is that we're going to run out of patience to fund the Ukrainians. And we've seen evidence of that. And we saw this at the EU when the 50 billion euro package was being held up.
Not from this parliament.
No. We saw that not from this country, but but the United States, 61 billion. And so we need to figure out a way to continue to immobilize Russia's ability to conduct this war, and the best way to do that is to work on this oil.
So what I'm hearing you say is that the sanctions are crippling the Russian economy, that financial sanctions have been effective in catching the right people and some substantial amounts of money, but that the main loophole is through oil, which being fungible is somehow ending up in the UK. Is that a good summary of what I just heard?
Exactly what I've...
Thank you very much. That's really a fascinating place to start. Drew?
Yeah, thank you. In February 2023, you wrote an op-ed on seized Russian assets, saying that these should be used to fund the war in Ukraine. What impact do you think that would have if that went ahead, if seized assets were able to be used for the war in Ukraine? What impact would it have in Ukraine?
Well, quite simply, if the West, the UK, US, EU, and other allies were to confiscate $300 billion, that would change the whole nature of the war. This war, ultimately, when it comes right down to it, is a resource war. Russia has more resources than Ukraine. Putin is banking on the fact that as the war drags on, we're going to have less appetite than he has to conduct the war, and that we're going to stop funding. And we've seen evidence of that. When I say we, I say that as a collective we. If this money were to be confiscated, this is 5 times what the U.S. had been dragging their feet on, 5 times the $61 billion that the U.S. had been dragging their feet on. And I think it would completely change the situation, and it particularly would change the situation in a context where we're almost 2.5 years into this war, and whether we like it or not, some of our allies are going to be less likely to fund this war. And I'm particularly concerned about what might happen in the United States. There's an election coming up on November 5th in the United States. If you read the opinion polls right now, it looks like Donald Trump is leading in the swing states, which would result in his victory. If he succeeds in becoming president, he's made it very clear that using his own words, this war would end in 24 hours. And what does he mean by that? I think he's made that also pretty clear, that he he would stop funding Ukraine. If the United States stops funding Ukraine, U.S. provides roughly half of all financial aid to Ukraine. That means that either Ukraine will probably lose the war, or we then have to double down. And this money, this $300 billion, would solve that problem. It would basically be an insurance policy against that problem.
There's been an institutional reluctance to take these steps. What impact do you think it would have on the market?
I don't think it would have any impact on the market. It's so one of the there's 3 or 4 big objections that are constantly thrown out. The one of those objections is, oh my God, if we were to confiscate this money, that would totally destabilize international financial markets. That's just not true. The money that's been confiscated, that's been frozen, if that money were to be confiscated by all of the allies, if we didn't do it by ourselves, if we did this together with the United States, with the EU, with Switzerland, with Canada, with Japan, those are all the countries that have what are called reserve currencies. What's a reserve currency? It's a liquid currency that people can store their money in. And the argument is that, or the naysayers say, if we were to confiscate this money, then people wouldn't keep their money in our country, or wouldn't keep their money in the EU, or wouldn't keep their money in the US. But if everybody does it together, where would people keep their money? I can guarantee you they're not going to keep their money in Iranian rials. They're not going to keep their money in Argentine pesos. They're going to keep their money in stable economies. Another word that's used in this discussion is unexpected consequences. Well, there's one really, I wouldn't say it's unexpected, an expected consequence, which is that the message here, if we do this, is that if you launch a war of aggression, an unprovoked war of aggression against a neighboring country that did nothing, you're likely to have your foreign exchange reserves confiscated. Well, who else is looking at a neighboring country considering a war of aggression that has a lot of foreign exchange reserves? China. And China has a lot more to lose than Russia has in this regard. And I think that we should be thinking a lot about what we can do to deter China from unsettling the situation over there with Taiwan. And this is a pretty good example.
On the just to kind of push a little further on the market situation, the Royal United Services Institute have said that the banks and central banks should commit to stabilising the market in the event of the seizure of the release to Ukraine of the seized Russian assets. What's your view of that?
I don't think there's any stabilizing need to be done. The main action, the main destabilizing action happened a week after the war started. The action was we froze the money. Mm-hmm. The money has already effectively become not theirs. And so, I can understand why banks wouldn't want this to happen, because it complicates their lives if money is being confiscated. By the way, I should point out that all sorts of people told me for many years, as I was advocating for the Magnitsky Act, that this would be completely impossible. It would mess everything up, unexpected consequences, etc. And then eventually the Magnitsky Act came into being, and the only people who really now are unhappy about it are the people who are sanctioned. Basically, if you're not going to invade foreign neighbors, you have nothing to worry about, and 99.9% of the money that's floating around the international financial system has nothing to do with this type of action.
I'm hearing a strong view from you that it's really just the will to do this that's the issue, as opposed to the issues in the market.
Everybody's afraid of doing something different because that's different, and there's a lot of people that will be holding on to tradition because it's easier to do that. But let's also flip this thing over for a second. Let's come back to the scenario that we have to continue funding this, and perhaps even double our funding because the United States steps back. So who funds it? The taxpayers of this country fund it. The taxpayers of the EU fund it. So should Vladimir Putin's legal rights to his money be more important than the taxpayers of this country's rights? I don't think so. And I don't think any of you would find any objection in your constituencies if you went and had that conversation. I think that we should be thinking about ourselves before we think about him.
You mentioned the EU just now. On the 8th of May, the EU announced plans to use the profit from seized Russian assets to aid Ukraine. What do you think of that action?
Well, it looks to me like a sort of a typical EU bad compromise. So there's no EU. There's not like a Mr. or Mrs. EU thinking about all the pluses and minuses and making decisions. You have 27 member states that are all negotiating with each other over this thing, with this argument and a few other arguments about why it shouldn't be done, and then the arguments about why it should be done, which is it's right, it's morally correct, it's financially correct, and it's politically correct. And they had this argument among 27 member states, and eventually they came up with this sort of fudge, which is to take the profits but not the capital. And from my perspective, first it's good to take something as opposed to nothing because Ukraine needs the money. But from my perspective, there's no difference between taking the profits and taking the money. To the extent, if we go to one of the other arguments about why this shouldn't be done is that there's no legal way to do it, which I disagree with and we can talk about. How is it different taking the profits than taking the money? And so I think this is just, in a certain way, unfortunate because it prolongs the inevitable. I mean,
given your strong view that it is a fudge, but I think also heard you say in there that it is at least something. Given that it's at least something, do you think the UK should follow suit, at least in that move?
What I think the UK should do is what the US has done. The US, well, let me take one step back. To the extent that there's any legal ambiguity about whether this money can be confiscated, the way you resolve legal ambiguity is to make law. That's what you do for a living. You make laws. And so the U.S., to address the possible legal ambiguity, passed something called the Repo Act. The Repo Act was passed along with the $61 billion aid package. And they've now resolved any legal ambiguity, and the United States government has the right to confiscate the money. What I would suggest is done here is some version of the Repo Act where, to the extent that there's any legal concern, that you legislate away that legal concern so that it can be properly done here. And by having the United States and the UK coming to that decision, it puts more pressure on the EU to do the right thing in the end.
Perhaps one very quick final question, because you've talked about the idea of getting everybody together to take this action. Given and I think you wrote about that in your article, so the US, Canada, Japan, the EU and Australia all need to unify around this. How likely is that? How likely is that to happen?
Well, I mean, it ended up happening. So when I started the Magnitsky Act campaign in 2012, it was only the U.S. who did it. And by the way, what I'm talking about with confiscating the reserves shouldn't take us 10 years like the Magnitsky Act. But I started with the U.S. and I was just one man. I was not the whole consensus of the world as we have right now that something needs to be done. But eventually we then got Canada, and then we got the UK, and then we got EU and Australia. Everybody will. It's the only logical, moral, rational thing to do. Everyone will come to the proper decision in the end, but it just takes some international pressure, diplomacy, reality, financial reality of the situation. And so I think it's likely to happen, but it's not going to happen unless we push for it. And that's, thankfully in this fight for the confiscating the reserves, it's not like just one man pushing for it. That we have a lot of people that believe this is the right thing to do.
Thank you.
And just to clarify, though, that you do think it needs to be done multilaterally.
It has to be done multilaterally because then it comes back to the issue which you've just raised, which is if one country does it, it does create the perception that that's not a safe country if another country hasn't done it.
Thank you. Siobhan.
Can I just say you're a complete inspiration for all of us who are campaigning for change in all sorts of campaigning spheres. So thank you very much. In your evidence to the committee, you spoke about how we can seize Russian state assets, but I wanted to look at assets owned by sanctioned individuals. The UK has frozen £22.7 billion worth of assets owned by private citizens and entities, but legally we don't have the tools to confiscate them. What measures would you suggest to confiscate those personal assets? Should we look at Canada's Special Economic Measures Act or something like that?
Well, I have a lot of experience in this area coming back to the Magnitsky case. So in the Magnitsky case, my lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, was killed. He was killed for uncovering a $230 million government corruption scheme. We traced the $230 million to many different countries. We then would file criminal complaints with the law enforcement authorities of those countries to freeze and confiscate that money. And the crime took place in 2007. And we're still involved in criminal or assisting different law enforcement authorities in criminal litigation in 2024. And so what I've learned from this process is that when you're going up against an individual, using the legal system, which I think has to be done, it's an extremely cumbersome, time-consuming process. I'm not saying it shouldn't be done. What I'm saying is that if we're looking for financial relief to Ukraine now, the Russian government has committed the crime. They've committed a crime of aggression. We have custody of their money. And we can confiscate their money, and it's all very clear. When it gets to an individual, the big problem is that the individual has property rights, and I don't think we should start confiscating individuals' money without going through a proper legal process. And the problem with those individuals' property rights is the first thing you have to prove is that individual was somehow formally connected to the Russian government and therefore bears some responsibility. And then proving that, and then you have to go through the rest of this process. I think that should be done. I think the oligarchs who are supporting the regime should have their money confiscated, but I think that's a longer-term process. I don't think we should ever unfreeze that money, but I think that the resources required to litigate that will be large, and I think that's something that needs to be thought about separately. And so I'm not saying it shouldn't be done, but I'm saying that in terms of the emergency that we have on our hands right now, the 80% of our efforts should be towards confiscating the state money, and then we can leave the other money frozen until we can figure out how to go about getting it.
As of the 23rd of February, 1,702 individuals and 298 entities have been subject to UK sanction. But there are many companies and individuals supporting Russia's war in Ukraine that have not been sanctioned. These include both Russian officials and oligarchs. If the government expanded the sanctions regime, who are the first people that they should target?
What I would say is we were just looking at this, and let me just get the list out. So the U.S. government did a project in 2017 where they asked the Treasury Department to come up with a list of who the Russian oligarchs were who were closest to Putin, and it was an official legal assignment. The Treasury Department came up with a list of 96 individuals. It's a published list, and of that list, we actually in the UK have sanctioned 57. The U.S. has only sanctioned 30, and the EU has only sanctioned 25. So we've done better, which is good. When I didn't know this until I got these numbers yesterday, so that's good. But that leaves us with 36 of these people not sanctioned. So what I would say, it's very easy. Let's get the list that the U.S. has produced. I mean, we could produce our own, but let's get the list that the U.S. Treasury has produced. Let's go down the list. Let's look at all the 36 people who have not been sanctioned, and if on the basis of the criteria that exists for the sanctions program for the invasion of Ukraine, we should then apply sanctions to them if the criteria applies. I think that would be the simplest, most broad way of doing it. I don't want to throw individual names out here today because I haven't done the research, but that's where I would start.
Let's hope 36 people are a bit worried right now.
Well, yeah, good. I mean, we're on Parliament TV, so...
In 2022, the government introduced a requirement for foreign businesses owning land or properties in the UK disclose their true owners in a registered overseas entities. It's how we found out that Igor Shivalov, a sanctioned member of Putin's inner circle, owned 2 flats across the road from the Ministry of Defence, which were worth about £11 million. But there's still a loophole because anyone who controls an offshore company can continue to hide the ownership in that trust. Do you agree that we need to close the loopholes so that the legislation also targets trusts?
Absolutely. There's no reason. So transparency or sunlight is the best disinfectant, and much better than any government regulation or anything. If everybody knows who owns what, then we can, public can then be upset about all this type of stuff. Any loophole which allows transparency not to exist should be closed, and that's a great example. And there's probably a few other of these types of loopholes where people can continue to hide their ownership, and we should have none of that here. This should be a hostile environment for criminals, money launderers, dictators, and other people. There's plenty of legitimate people in the world who can come here, spend their money, bring good things to this country. We don't need the criminals.
I've got another question, but I realise I've been going on for a bit, so... Sure, I've got one last question. To crack down on sanctioned individuals keeping money in the UK, the defence think tank RUSI has suggested that we create tripwires. That is where you create a new offence that you would then judge these oligarchs to have committed. Do you think that's a sensible way forward?
Well, I'm not familiar with the details of the proposal, so I don't want to comment on that, but I do want to comment on one thing which is really important, which is that one of the things which I learned about from all of the work we did on the Magnitsky case is that there is a whole sort of ecosystem of what we call enablers. These are people who, lawyers, accountants, trustees, company formation agencies, PR firms that work on behalf of bad people to help them launder their money, hide their money, and continue to manage their money when it's laundered and hid. And one of the things which, and I think that when we're talking about the amount of money that's been frozen in the UK, of 20, I think the number you mentioned was 23 billion, that's a drop in the ocean of how much money is actually in the UK that belongs to people who have done bad things. And the reason that's a lower number than the real number is because a lot of the money is hidden. Most of the money is still hidden. How do we unhide that money? I have an idea, and I've been talking about this since the war began, and that is that if we were to put a provision in law in the next iteration of the sanctions law, which said that any accountant, lawyer, trustee, etc., who worked for an individual who is sanctioned would have a duty of law to come forward to the government and share the information about the ownership of assets of the sanctioned individual. If you take the poachers and turn them into the gamekeepers, all of a sudden that number of 23 billion would probably go to 230 billion. And it would probably cause any future lawyer, accountant, etc., not to want to get involved in this thing unless they knew that their clients were proper, legitimate individuals.
Angela.
Thank you very much. I think that we've talked about sanctioning state-owned assets, but isn't it one of the features of the Putin regime that a lot of state-owned assets were actually taken out of Russia under the safekeeping of particular oligarchs, and there was a big battle between the old oligarchs and the Putin-affiliated oligarchs to have control of a lot of these state assets that are essentially being hidden in places like London. But so effectively the individual-owned assets aren't really individually owned at all. I mean, they are basically extensions of the state, and Putin would expect them to be returned to him if he wished to use them in any way. Doesn't this dissolve, for all intents and purposes, the distinction between individually owned oligarch assets and state assets?
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, we've done the work, and we estimate that between the year 2000 and 2024, Putin and the top 1,000 officials have stolen $1 trillion from the Russian state, and Putin doesn't keep any of his money in his own name. The money is held by trustees and oligarchs and so on, and so that money should be immobilized for sure. There's no question. The only issue is it's a much cleaner legal case to go after the state's money than it is to go unpack that. And I do believe in property rights. You can't just broad brush and say that person is Russian, therefore their money should be confiscated. No, I think that's wrong. We can't do that. That would upset. Coming back to your original question, that would upset financial markets if people thought that they're just by being born in a country or having a connection to a country that does something bad, that would put all their money at risk. I mean, everybody has property rights and the legal right to represent themselves, but I do believe, and I completely agree with you, that most of the Russian oligarchs are trustees for Vladimir Putin, that the money being held is effectively the money that belongs to the Russian state, and that the legal process should absolutely begin to try to take that money away from them. But I'm just saying that it's going to be a very long, hard road, and in terms of dealing with the emergency, the current emergency, we shouldn't expect any financial results. Those financial results are going to come a decade from now if properly litigated, not today.
Rights, human rights, rule of law, very important for individuals. But what we've got here is effectively a criminal enterprise which has stolen assets from, you could call it the Russian state, I might say the Russian people, to use in this web of arbitrary behaviour and criminality, of which the oligarchs are the most obvious examples. How do we overcome rights that are clearly there for a very good reason, human rights, property rights, rule of law, to deal with this obvious laundering that's going on? And we'll answer that, and then there's another issue I want to raise with you.
Well, I mean, I think that the laws are actually in place to do something here.
Proceeds of crime?
The unexpected wealth orders, etc. And again, I've got very, very direct experience in this area, and a very unfortunate experience in this area, which is, as I mentioned, the Magnitsky case, the 230 million, we traced all the money. The largest share of the 230 million came to the UK. And whenever we found money going to the country, we'd then file a criminal complaint with the relevant law enforcement authorities. And in most countries, the law enforcement authorities opened criminal cases. Here in the UK, they didn't. We filed a criminal complaint with the Serious Fraud Office, no case opened. With the Economic Crimes Department of the Metropolitan Police, no case opened. What used to be called the Serious Organized Crime Agency, no case opened. With the HMRC, no case opened. With the National Crime Agency, no case opened. And eventually, Well, I'll tell you why. Eventually, one of the people who I'd written to after he had retired from the National Crime Agency came to me, and he said, I thought a case should be opened, and I was overruled and under extreme pressure not to open a case by somebody very senior in the National Crime Agency. And what I've learned is it wasn't specific to our case. No cases. There was not a single economic crimes case from Russia opened since Putin has come to power in this country. Why? I don't think that I don't think it's malicious. I think it's the law enforcement agencies of this country are badly resourced. I think per capita, U.S. spends much more than the U.K. On these issues. But also the law. So you start out with a low budget in all these different agencies, and then you have this thing where if a case goes to court, and the government loses even on a minor procedural point in court, there's just like a disclosure order which they issued, which was been fought, and then the defendant wins. They've got to pay like £50,000 to the other side for the costs of that particular order, and these people don't even have the budget to start out with to do the case. And so, with the incentives so badly skewed against them, what's the natural career reaction of an official in the National Crime Agency or the Crown Prosecution Service or whomever? Is you just don't open cases.
Which is why the UK is a centre for this kind of fraudulent activity and has been infiltrated by Russian money so badly. Exactly.
And I have direct experience working with many different countries. This is the worst. And I say that it's worse than like Latvia. In Latvia, you can actually conduct criminal cases. Here, there's almost a pride in not doing it. And the only way to fix that is to change the whole structure, which is, and I proposed this in the last sanctions bill that came forward, which is to take away any possibility of cost orders against the government. And then the second thing to do is to, if the government wins, if the National Crime Agency wins, they should keep the money and then use that money to fund future prosecutions. That's how they.
I mean, this is easily fixed.
All it is a couple lines, but it gets slapped down every time. And this should be a totally multi-partisan issue. There should be nobody against this. But the people who are against this are the legal community. The people who are against this are people who just
They're getting vast amounts of money out of representing oligarchs, though, aren't they?
They absolutely are.
But this is corrupting our country.
It's not corrupting. It's corrupted our country.
And in the US, they can keep the proceeds.
The Department of Justice keeps the proceeds when they do these confiscation orders.
I think that is a devastating series of observations which we need to take extremely seriously, and I also think that your suggestions for changing it are simple but would be very, very effective if they were put into place. However, it would mean that the ecosystem that you were talking about of enablers would have their standards of living hit, isn't that?
And they'll come to some committee like this, and then they'll tell you how it's going to completely change the world, and it's impossible, and if we do that, everything will be bad, and so on and so forth. That's what will happen, and somehow it all gets watered down, and it doesn't happen. And I've specifically worked on these specific amendments with colleagues of yours in Parliament in the last sanctions bill, and it all got kicked out.
You might forward them to us as well, so that we can have a look at them for our report.
Thank you.
But
Stephen.
Yeah, but just following on from what Dame Angela's just said, the reality is, of course, is we've already given protection against coming back against the FCA in certain areas. So it would hardly be a surprise if we wanted to extend it to other agencies. The precedent is there already for us to use. Can I just take you back to sort of the beginning? Can we just run through some of the differences in various regimes? The Institute of Chartered Accountants of England said traditionally the UK's financial sanctions regimes were aligned with the EU and the US. They now think since Russian sanctions have come in, there's been some disparity in the sanction system. I guess, three questions follow on from that. One is, do you agree with that view? Do you think the EU and the US themselves are aligned? And actually, given what you said right in your opening remarks, are these minor differences that don't really matter given the scale of sanctions that's in place?
Well, so it's a problem that we don't have harmonized sanctions, and let me just give you a few examples. So, and as I said, the UK has actually done a better job in terms of sanctioning oligarchs than the US and the EU. And so, for example, you have Vagit Alekperov. He is the CEO of Lukoil. Lukoil is one of the most important oil companies in Russia and a great supporter of Putin. He's sanctioned here in the UK, but he's not sanctioned in the EU or US. You have Vladimir Potanin. He's sanctioned here. Vladimir Potanin is the CEO of Norilsk Nickel. He's also one of the people who Putin has been assigning to buy up interests in when a foreign corporation wants to pull out of Russia and they have to sell at pennies on the dollar. He's been one of the big recipients of like free money from people pulling out. He's been sanctioned here. He's been sanctioned by the U.S., but he's not been sanctioned in the EU. And so, what do you do if you're Potanin? You go to the EU. He can still travel to Courchevel and Cala di Volpe in Italy and all that kind of stuff. And so now we can't control who they sanction, but there has to be a very big effort to, and this is something that should be really pushed hard, is to harmonize these sanctions so that these people can't go anywhere, because as long as they can find loopholes. And by the way, in the Magnitsky case itself, the EU doesn't have. The EU only has human rights sanctions. They don't have corruption sanctions. We have human rights and corruption. U.S. has human rights and corruption, etc. And so all the people who were involved in the financial crime that Sergei Magnitsky was killed over, they can't travel here. They can't travel to the U.S. They can't go to Canada. They can't go to Australia, but they can go anytime they want to the EU. And until the EU plugs these loopholes, it's a big problem because it doesn't achieve the objective.
So at the beginning, I think you said there's been about 350 billion of sanctions. Have you made any estimate of how much money has evaded sanctions because of discrepancies in various sanctions regimes?
I don't have any estimate, but it's going to be a huge number because that's what these people do. I mean,
so you've got the discrepancy in the regime, and then perhaps equally as importantly, you've got discrepancy in implementation. You've just
well, I mean, I could estimate here and now, which is that we've estimated that $1 trillion was taken out of Russia during this 24-year period, and we're only talking about a few $100 billion that's been caught. So there's probably a much greater amount, $700 billion of money, which is still floating around somewhere, which hasn't been touched because either the sanctions or enablers are hiding the money.
Just in terms of implementation, as opposed to the difference in the regimes which you point out, and we recognise we should be pushing governments to become more unified on, where do you think the best implementation of sanctions regimes is happening? You've already spoken about the repo law in the US, and as I understand it in the US, there's now a law against wealth managers who act for sanctioned or potentially sanctioned individuals, or potentially individuals from sanctioned countries. Is that right? And is that a world-leading way of cutting off networks?
So the U.S. is always most aggressive in any kind of law enforcement sanctions work, and they're probably the best practice in terms of emulating things. But having said that, the UK has as I've mentioned, has sanctioned more oligarchs than the US has. The US is sort of like a supertanker, slow-moving, but you never want to be on the wrong side of the US when it comes to any of these types of things. Here, we're a little bit less aggressive about the whole thing, and so, as I said, a lot of these people have money in trusts. So, I can remember a story. It was about a big property located in I think it was owned by Alisher Usmanov, who was one of the sanctioned individuals, and And I think a day before he owns this huge property up in Hampstead, and he just transferred it to his sister a day before the whole sanctions program came in. She became the beneficiary of the trust that owned the property. And so we should look at every one of these sanctions evasion mechanisms that they use, and we should legislate against it going forward. And it comes to moving things around.
So presumably, if we had a regime like the politically exposed persons regime, a sanctions exposed persons regime, I mean, you can be politically exposed, so members of your family have to declare things. If we had the same sort of regime in place and was implemented across multilaterally, that would start to fill the hole that you were talking about.
It would. Yes.
And one final question, if I may. We've talked about the different regimes that are around, particularly in implementation. How would you propose that the UK government should get multilateral agreement? What are we doing that we need to do more of to persuade others to fill the gaps in their regimes?
Well, I think the best way of getting people to fill the gaps in their regimes is to point out where they're not adequate. Sometimes diplomacy is appropriate. Sometimes polite diplomacy is appropriate, and sometimes one should be a little bit less polite. And we're in a war right now, whether we want to admit it or not. There's a war going on, and we're participants, and we shouldn't make any mistake about it. And at the moment, we can fight this war. At the moment, there's no bloodshed coming from. There's not a drop of blood from a British soldier, but we're fighting a financial war, and we should fight it as tough as we can fight it, because that's the battlefield we're on right now.
Thank you very much for your evidence, Mr. Browder, and for all your campaigning. Can you just use this final opportunity? Is there anything else that you wanted to recommend to this committee before we bring this panel to a close?
Well, so the one thing which we haven't talked about, and I think you're going to be talking about it in your next session, is the oil and where it goes. And I've got the names of the refineries that refine Russian oil and sell it back to us. And I just want to put it out there, put it on the record, so that we should think about either applying sanctions to these refineries or creating some type of legislation where we're not allowed to buy oil from these refineries or source them. And I'm just going to put it out here for the record. In India, we have the Vadinar refinery, which is 49% owned by Russia's state oil company Rosneft, and they receive Russian oil and they sell Russian oil refined product back to us. We have the Jamnagar refinery in the Gulf of Kutch on India's western coast, which is a leading destination for Russian crude arriving in India. We have the Bharat Petroleum, which is a state-run company. And then we have the Hindustan Petroleum, another state-run company. In Turkey, we have Star Refinery, which concluded a deal with Russian oil company Lukoil. And in China, we have Sinopec Group and CNOOC. I think that those are all companies that buy Russian oil. When we talk about India, China, and Turkey, we're talking about specific companies. We don't have to sanction India, China, and Turkey. We can just go after the companies that are buying the oil. And just me saying that probably here in a public setting on the record where but if you start to say that, if you put this into your report, that's the kind of pressure that these companies don't need. I mean, they can get oil from anywhere. They don't have to take Russian oil. And if Russian oil doesn't find a home so easily, the price goes down, they get less revenues, and they have less money to fight this war.
Thank you very much, Mr. Browder. That leaves us perfectly segging into our next session, which is on exactly this subject. Is there anything else that you wanted to put on the record?
Well, I could talk for hours, but I think you've given me a great opportunity. Thank you.
Well, order. I'm going to briefly suspend the session while we bring the next panel to give us evidence.
The proceeding is currently suspended. 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 The proceeding is currently suspended.
Order, and we're resuming with our second panel in our inquiry into sanctions on Russia. And I'm going to start by asking our second panel to introduce themselves, starting with yourself, Richard.
Good morning, I'm Richard Bronze. I'm head of Geopolitics at Energy Aspects, which is a research company focused on global energy markets. My work concentrates on the impact of sanctions and other political developments on those markets.
Thank you. Emma.
Good morning, my name's Emma Hardaker. I'm the Head of Financial Crime and Compliance at Lloyds of London, which is a global insurance. We oversee a global insurance market with a 300-year history of insurance and reinsurance, particularly in maritime.
Arabella.
Hi, I'm Arabella Ramage. I'm the Legal Director at the Lloyds Market Association. We represent the managing agents who actually participate within the Lloyds market. So we fall between Lloyds, the corporation, and the syndicates that participate within Lloyds.
Thank you very much. Let's start with the evidence that you just heard Mr. Browder give us about the oil price cap. In your opinion, Mr. Bronze, is the oil price cap working?
In a short answer, no. If we take the big picture, what are sanctions intended to do? Deter or prevent Russia's activities and invasion of Ukraine. They failed to deter, and they're failing to stop or seriously hinder. That doesn't mean they're not having any impact at all. I think Mr. Browder talked about the impact on the Russian economy. I would agree there is a significant impact on many parts of the Russian economy. I think even within the energy sector, there is a substantial loss of revenue. Russian oil sells at much greater discounts than it did historically. Russia is selling less gas by pipeline, and those are affecting Russian private sector and government revenues. But I think the amount of that we can attribute to the price cap and the mechanism that was intended to drive those prices down feels very limited. I think much more of that impact has come from the EU import ban, from the ban on imports by the UK, the US, and by the kind of Western financial sanctions more broadly.
So would you agree with the evidence that we heard from the Royal United Service Institute that the oil price cap is actually being breached left and right very frequently?
There's certainly indications of that. There's a very, I think, we've just started over the turn of the year to see a bit of enforcement by the US authorities, a little bit of, and very limited enforcement by the UK authorities. But I think there's a lot of circumstantial evidence that suggests that, particularly last year, a lot of oil was probably moving above the price cap, potentially with forged or misstated documents provided to the maritime service providers. But I think more significantly now, we're seeing less and less of Russia's oil exports relying on Western vessels or Western financial services. The idea, the premise at the heart of the price cap was that access to these maritime services was so important, it would give buyers in third countries the leverage to force Russia to sell its oil below the price cap. And I just never think we've seen that behaviour. Instead, what we've seen is a big migration of those flows to vessels that are colloquially called part of the shadow fleet. The ownership is opaque, the control, I think colleagues will talk about the insurance arrangements not coming from Western service companies. And I think that has limited the effectiveness of the oil cap. And it also raises big concerns about the future safety, the environmental implications if one of these tankers does get into an accident. Most of these are very old vessels. Maintenance standards may not be the same. And I think that raises lots and lots of concerns. I think the idea of the oil price cap, the theory was there, but I think in practice it just hasn't worked.
And you heard Mr. Browder name specific refineries where Russian oil is being refined and then sold on, refineries, I think, mainly in India. Is that something that you agree with, that evidence?
We don't take a policy sort of position, so we're not recommending anything. But in the question of, are there refineries which are importing Russian oil, crude oil, processing it, and are those same refineries exporting to countries that are part of the price cap coalition? Yes, it appears so. It is trickier to say, are the molecules of Russian oil the same ones once processed that are loaded onto tankers and coming back in. But nothing in that flow, if those molecules are refined or processed, that's permitted under the rules as they've been set by the UK and other G7 countries at the moment.
And so you're not recommending any changes because you don't recommend any policy changes?
We don't take a view, but certainly we just analyse the state of the markets and analyse the potential impacts of different policy proposals.
And you do agree that it is likely that Russian oil is still ending up in the UK?
Once it's been processed or transformed by a refinery, yes.
Yeah, thank you. How much can you estimate?
Probably not significant volumes. These refineries, particularly in India, are a long distance from UK markets. So just from an economic perspective, we import far more of our oil from European countries, far more from the US. So most of it will be going to other destinations. It will probably be well below the sort of 5% of our total imports, but there will be some.
And although you don't make a policy recommendation, is it your opinion that it would be relatively easy to stop that oil coming into the UK if people did implement policies?
I think it would be technically quite complex depending how you wanted to implement it. Again, the way that refineries usually operate is they will import and process oil from different sources. In some cases, certain refineries may now be running predominantly or exclusively on Russian oil because it's cheaper than the alternatives. But where they're processing from different sources, the question would come, would you prohibit any exports from that refinery, or would you introduce some sort of mechanism to say, we only want to prohibit the molecules that started out in Russia and have been processed from coming to the UK? And there are approaches you could potentially implement, but I think they become very tricky, and already the price cap as it stands is quite a complicated mechanism. If you added a layer like this, it would add more complexity for the industry to manage. You know, that's a political choice. If you decide to do that, then the industry will have to work its way through that. But I think there would be hopes from within the market that there'll be consultation and discussion about what mechanisms and what approaches would be the most straightforward to implement.
Emma, in your written evidence, you state that placing sanctions on parties that purchase Russian oil would have a negative impact on the overall global price of oil. What do you see happening in that case?
In terms of to sanction all purchasers of Russian oil, you mean?
Well, it's your quote in your evidence. Yeah.
I think the issue there would be the original intent behind the policy on the oil price cap, as I understand it, was to keep some oil flowing, particularly for third countries, and to keep that oil flowing at a price that was sensible for those countries. And I think if there was to be a total ban, then that would have an adverse effect on that policy intention.
Okay. And insurance, I mean, all of these refineries need insurance, all of these shadow fleet ships presumably are insured, these cargoes are insured. Are you confident that none of that insurance is being purchased in the UK?
Yes, I am. I'm confident it's not being purchased through legitimate sources. I think you have evidence from the Kyiv School of Economics before you that shows shadow fleet that approximately 72 to 78% of that of Russian oil exports are now coming through the shadow fleet. Those ships would not be insured in the Lloyds market.
And would there be any reinsurance for any of these entities that's getting reinsured through the Lloyds market, through entities that maybe are disguising the original cargo or the original asset?
I think Richard put it very well. The more complicated that sanctions compliance is, the less easy it is to have a strength of sanctions compliance. Once you move into the world of reinsurance, the visibility gets much less. And you're correct to identify that the further down the insurance chain you get, the more difficult it is.
So you couldn't be absolutely confident that sanctioned entities, people, individuals, and Russian oil is not benefiting from being reinsured in the Lloyds market?
So the exposure there would be where insurance is being written outside the Lloyds market that was then reinsured back into Lloyds.
Yeah.
That is an area where it is very difficult to be able to see that far into the reinsurance. However, what I can say is that the appetite within the Lloyds market for conducting sanctioned business, there is no appetite within the Lloyds market for conducting sanctioned business. I will also point out, and my colleague can expand a bit more on, the sanctions clauses that are in insurance contracts, such that if sanctioned products are under the insurance contract, that contract of insurance is then suspended.
I'm sure we'll have more questions as we progress through this session, but I'm going to bring in Samantha at this stage.
Thank you. Richard, if I understand you correctly, you don't think the sanctions on Russian energy supplies have been effective?
I think sanctions as a whole have achieved, they've forced down the amount of revenue that Russia is securing. Some of that has been offset, particularly in 2022, because global energy prices rose so much. Now that mostly oil and gas prices have returned to lower kind of levels, we are still seeing Russia selling less gas, similar amounts of oil, but with bigger discounts. So Western sanctions in totality, I think, have been and are reducing Russia's revenues. The Russian government has modified its tax rules, so the amount that the government receives hasn't fallen by as much at the expense of private or state-linked companies. But I think the original question from the chair was more about the oil price cap, and I think that's the least effective in practice element of the overall package when we're talking about the goal of reducing Russian oil revenues. I think, as Emma said, this probably the main aim of the oil price cap, and I think why it was originally introduced in 2022, was actually as a pressure release valve on those other sanctions. In Europe, there were discussions in the spring and summer of 2022 about a complete ban on maritime services provision for moving Russian oil to countries like India and China. And I think the eventual decision within the G7 was that risked exacerbating the energy price crisis. So create the oil price cap, give a mechanism that those third countries could still access Western services with the hope or the aim that they would do so at discounted prices.
How effective do you think sanctions relating to energy can be without the cooperation of India and China?
I think that we are hitting up against the limits of the efficacy and the reach of sanctions, particularly without a willingness or an appetite amongst governments to significantly disrupt flows. You have two competing aims, and the not disrupting flows always seems to be the one that's given precedence. You don't see from India or China any political will or appetite to voluntarily reduce their intake of discounted and cheap oil from Russia, and I think the mechanism or the tool that was thought to be there in terms of the access to Western kind of shipping and services hasn't proved anywhere near as effective as it was hoped.
What difference would it make to the effectiveness of the sanctions regime if all countries in the EU banned liquefied natural gas products from Russia?
I think this is something which is under discussion as part of the next European sanctions package, which will be the 14th package, along with various more limited options like a ban on LNG transshipment. Although Europe has significantly reduced its imports of pipeline gas, it still takes a significant volume of Russian LNG, if anything more so than before the start of the Russian invasion in 2022. I think were that to be banned, it would be a further hit for Russian revenues because those LNG cargoes would need to move to longer haul destinations in Asia, but overall gas prices would increase. So the UK, Europe, all markets would feel some of the effects of that. And again, much like we saw with oil and gas when the energy price crisis was at its peak, Russia would see some of the negative effect of those sanctions mitigated, even if it sold lower volume. If it was selling that at higher prices, even with higher shipping costs, the net result may not be as much as we would hope.
And do you think the UK and EU's greater reliance on liquefied natural gas, particularly from the US, have any impact on energy security or the transition to green energy?
I think that overall access to LNG is a positive from an energy security perspective. Historically, gas markets have been much more regionally concentrated because of the dependence on pipeline flows, and that creates exposure and risk, as we've seen with much of continental Europe, and its struggle and its slow pace of disconnecting itself from its reliance on Russian pipeline gas. That was enabled by bringing in a lot of first LNG import infrastructure, and then by bringing in a lot of LNG imports from other destinations, predominantly the US. So I think LNG can be beneficial in giving more access from energy security at times. That can be a double-edged sword, because if prices in another region are being pushed up by an event or a crisis there, the more interconnected gas markets are, the more that those effects will reach beyond that region. But if the crisis is here in the region that we're connected to, we benefit from having that LNG access.
So could sanctions have a long-term impact on trade patterns in the way that you're describing, I think, and the energy market long after they've been lifted? And if so, what are they likely to be, particularly for the UK?
I think there are two parts to this. The first is the question of how quickly could or would sanctions be lifted. One of the conversations I have a lot with clients who are participating in the energy market is, well, what if scenarios? Say that the conflict in Ukraine ends, how quickly would the UK, the US, European roll back these sanctions? Would we return rapidly to a situation where none of the energy restrictions that are in place today are maintained? I think that's unlikely. I think an awareness in political circles will remain that a reliance on Russian energy has security consequences, and even if the conflict in Ukraine is resolved, as we kind of all hope it will be, I don't think that concern will go away whilst the current government in Moscow remains in power. So the first question is, how quickly would sanctions actually be lifted? And then the second is, how quickly would traders and buyers return if the sanctions weren't in place? And I think you would see that moving back, but I think it would be at differing paces for different organisations. Just as in 2022 we saw quite a bit of self-sanctioning, companies going over and above what was legally mandated because of the reputational risks, because of the political concerns. I think equally, I don't think the day after you lifted sanctions, everybody will be rushing back in to sign contracts unless a lot else has changed in the interim. For the UK, I think that does mean energy is going to be flowing less efficiently over longer distances. We will be feeling that to some extent in the prices that we're paying to import wholesale, and also consumers will feel that to some degree in the prices they pay. The more that we layer restrictions or complexity onto that global market, the more that will come through in the cost chain.
The Financial Times has reported that Gazprom has plunged to its biggest loss in at least a quarter of a century after gas sales more than halved as a result of sanctions. Is this sort of impact replicated across the energy sector?
Well, Gazprom is a bit of a unique position in terms of it's the major exporter of Russian pipeline gas. So given we've seen such a big reduction in Russian pipeline exports to European countries, which were historically its main customer, and because you can't simply redirect those flows, there isn't pipeline infrastructure to move that to alternative buyers in Asia, it's no surprise after a very, very strong financial years for Gazprom in 2021 and 2022 that last year it did see much worse results, but I don't think it's replicated. If you look at Novatek, which is Russia's kind of biggest LNG exporter, its financial results were much stronger last year because Russia's LNG exports haven't fallen as much. And I think the Russian oil producers, although we have less visibility on their finances, it won't be as clear-cut a picture of their revenues having been significantly reduced because the volume they're selling is still not that far below pre-war levels.
Thank you very much. Drew.
Thank you. Emma, I want to focus on some of the insurance issues that were touched on by our chair earlier. First of all, how would you describe the impact of Russian sanctions on the insurance industry?
I think if we're talking specifically about the maritime aspect and the oil price cap, the appetite, as I mentioned earlier, for doing Russian oil, insuring Russian oil has reduced to almost nothing. It's a very complex regime to comply with, and the complexity, the record-keeping demands, the reporting demands, all are off-putting to insurers. But there's also the reputational aspect of involvement with any aspect of Russian business. If I step back to the start of the Ukrainian situation, the impact on the insurance industry was extensive. We had very complex sanctions to get to grips with incredibly quickly. There were a number of areas where...
Was that difficult for the industry?
It involved a huge amount of effort and a lot of conversations with various government departments, with OFSI, particularly around getting the drafting right of the sanctions. They came in very, very quickly. At the end of February 22, there was a huge amount of detail to get through, and I have every sympathy for government departments who were trying to produce a quick response to the situation. What worked incredibly well was that conversation with government, conversation with OFSI, to then produce the general licences to subsequently get the drafting right and to be able to help government departments understand the nuances of the insurance industry and how we could effect the sanctions, but also areas where we needed those general licences.
Do you feel that the insurance industry is generally supportive of the aims of the sanctions regime?
The insurance industry has worked really hard with government to make the sanctions regimes work.
Slightly
yes.
Different answer to the question. Do you feel that there's support there for the aims of the...
Yes,
you do?
absolutely.
Okay, thank you. When you gave written evidence to this committee, you said, the Lloyds of London evidence, you said there is a cost element to consider regarding the implementation by the private sector. What is the cost? Can you tell us?
I don't have a particular number, but I think you can see some of the cost both in what OFSI is now spending and what OFSI has done in the past year or so in terms of recruitment. I think you can see it from the size of compliance departments within the market and more broadly within the financial services sector. They are expanding. I can tell you when you needed sanctions expertise in February, March, April, in fact through most of 2022, it was very difficult to get and the market was very competitive.
Quite surprised by that answer in a way, because I would have thought in the insurance industry, where every penny I would imagine is accounted for and the actuary tables are worked out to see the effect of things, that there isn't an estimate of the cost in that somewhere. Is there a figure, or is it just that you don't have it to hand? Or
I don't believe there is a figure, no. Arabella?
No, I don't think there is. Because what you're talking about is the size of the compliance teams. I don't think they're very easy to measure.
Okay, like I said, I find that quite surprising, because I would have thought that was something that would have been quantified somewhere. If it's worth describing a cost, that there would be a cost, but we'll move on. You've also told us that during or after event assessments have led to further complicated measures being imposed on industry, which sometimes can be difficult to navigate through. Can you give us some examples of those?
Yes, so perhaps if we again go back to February 2022, the initial set of sanctions that was imposed, we had particular issues around the imposition of sanctions on vessels. Now, that included aeroplane hulls, that included marine hulls, and it also created issues around space infrastructure, so the International Space Station, for example. That had particularly complicated fallout for the insurance industry and was the reason that we needed a general licence in order to address it. As I said earlier, we appreciate that things were moving at speed in February 2022. When it came to the oil price cap, there were good conversations between governments and industry, but nonetheless there have still been nuances that it would have been helpful to get across in advance and to have considered at the time.
Your written evidence states that investors based in the UK have lost business to competitors based in non-G7 countries as sanctions haven't been implemented there. Can you quantify the impact then on the UK market from that?
I don't have a number to hand. I'm sure I can see if we can get one for you.
Okay, thank you. And finally, is there a risk that individuals and businesses based in non-G7 countries are no longer adequately insured? And if so, what's the impact of the lack of insurance coverage likely to be?
So I would say yes, that there is that risk that there is no longer adequate insurance. There was a quote from Ingerstrack, the Russian insurer, in the FT a few weeks ago, where they said they had sanctioned. We understand Ingerstrack is providing at least some of the insurance, for example, to the Russian shadow fleet. They said themselves they have a sanctions clause in their insurance contracts and would invoke that if necessary. That leaves even the shadow fleet potentially without any operating insurance. Where shipments are moving possibly without insurance or without adequate insurance, particularly if there is a marine spill, yes, there is an issue in terms of who would pay for that cleanup, who would be responsible for it, and how the financial impact of that would be managed.
And just to follow up on that last point there about how the financial impact, where is that felt?
There are various international bodies which provide some coverage for marine spills. But at the end of the day, when the such insurance and funds as were available ran out, it would be the responsibility of the state that was cleaning up the particular spill.
Taxpayers?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Drew. Kia.
Thank you. I'd like to ask a few more questions about the maritime insurance sector in particular, if that's okay. Would you agree with the view to start off that parts of the UK's insurance sector are facilitating the sidestepping of sanctions by underwriting Russian oil that's moved by sea?
No, I would not.
Fair enough. I do wonder, though, the answer you previously gave about there not being appetite for insuring shipments that didn't comply with sanctions, if you combine that with the point that you made about reinsurance, it's fine to say that there might not be appetite, but if it becomes very opaque as to whether or not it's happening, it could still be taking place, couldn't it, within the UK insurance sector?
So reinsurance, we have you do have sanctions clauses within the contract which say that if it's anything that's sanctioned or illegal, it will not be paid out. So it's fair to say that you'd usually see this when there was a claim. That would be the point that you'd be getting the most information. I'm not aware that there is reinsurance going on of illegal activity.
No, I think that's correct. If you look at the structure as brokers bring a contract of insurance or indeed a contract of reinsurance, because of the sanctions compliance requirements, the brokers, the underwriters, the managing agents are all considering sanctions at each and every stage of the placement. So no, I don't have any information that any reinsurance is being written in the Lloyds market.
Could you help me understand, it seems to be therefore that there's sort of a bit of incongruence between what you're saying and the Centre for Research on Energy and Clean Air identified the UK as the world's biggest insurer for Russian oil transported by cargo ship, with our maritime insurance industry underwriting 33% of all Russian oil moved by sea between the initial implementation of sanctions and November 2023. Does that relate to the point you made about having to quickly comply with sanctions and about there being opaqueness in implementation, or how does that number square against your previous answer to my first question?
So I think the answer may be in the fact that actually the oil price cap was not intended to stop all Russian oil flowing. So when it's legitimate, it could be insured. And there's been quite a lot of confusion around the figures, I think, that have been being put out in the press and more generally as to whether it's legitimate trade or whether it's trade that's over the oil cap. And I think you need to draw that distinction quite carefully. There's been a bit of an issue here while we've been talking about oil once it hits the refineries, because the oil price cap doesn't apply once the oil's been landed and has been changed into a different form. So you will see oil, for instance, after it's hit the refineries, being insured completely legitimately at the moment.
Mm. And are there any tools that you would give either to Ofsted or the UK government to better allow the maritime insurance industry to either cut through that complexity or meet its compliance obligations in a way that is less that piles less cost onto the insurance industry?
So the phrase I have written down is sanctions compliance is stronger the simpler the regime is. The oil price cap regime is very complicated to comply with. Mr. Browder made reference to discrepancies between oligarch lists across US, EU and UK. We also experienced discrepancies in the implementation of sanctions regimes, including the oil price cap regime, between US, EU and UK. That strong compliance comes from harmonisation. Mr. Browder also made reference to loopholes in the oil price cap, part of which is to do with the G7 plus countries are the signatories to the oil price cap. There are countries that are not signatories to that. That creates additional complexity and room for those loopholes.
In our last session, Tom Keating from Brucey gave evidence and said that Lloyds of London holds information that could be used to identify insurers providing insurance in breach of the sanctions regime, and that these names could be added to the sanctions lists. Do you agree with him? Is that information that you have?
I made a note of that comment that Mr. Keating made, and I need to have a chat with him about it, because I would be very interested to know what that information is. It's not an information source that I'm familiar with, so I will raise Mr. Keating.
And if Lloyds of London were privy to kind of information of that kind, would they be forthcoming in releasing it if asked to by the UK government?
Yes, absolutely. We've cooperated with the UK government all the way along in the implementation of sanctions, and would continue to do so.
And just on the size of the dark fleet that was made reference to earlier, can you put in kind of physical terms for the benefit of the committee how large that fleet is and what share of Russian oil exports it currently accounts for?
The numbers I have are the ones, as I mentioned, from the Kyiv School of Economics, that the dark fleet is taking about 72 to 78% of Russian oil now.
And if it helps, I can add to that analysis we've done suggests there are around 250 to 300 unique tankers lifting Russian crude oil each quarter. So those vary over time, but it's probably 500-600 vessels have been involved since the start of the price cap. Not all of those will be shadow fleet. Some of them may be legitimate. Some of them may not be part of what we call the shadow fleet and may have been moving oil beneath the price cap and then gone on and done other non-Russia related trade. I think there was, in some written evidence provided to the committee, a figure of 800 tankers. That feels high, but not totally out of the realm. You know, the range we're talking is somewhere in the mid-hundreds, I would guess.
Okay, and just finally, I think Drew picked up on the point that when it comes to oil spills through the risks of non-insurance of what are quite, in some instances it appears to be quite old and rickety vessels to transport this oil, the book is eventually passed on to the taxpayers of whichever nation state ends up having to foot the bill. In their evidence, RUSI mentioned about better policing of maritime choke points and making sure that those vessels are compliant, and if not, having sanctions in place or consequences that effectively deter them using certain passages. Do you see that as being an area of enforcing sanctions compliance that is going to become a greater part of how the G7 responds to this sort of trade? Do you think I just think of the state of the UK Royal Navy in particular, do you think that that's something that could be practically implemented by G7 members?
I think there are very legitimate concerns. If you look, for instance, in the Danish Straits, which is quite a complex shipping route to navigate, I think there was a vessel which was unloaded, fortunately at the time, that had a kind of near-miss accident that was reported in the press in recent weeks. I think, a lot of these vessels are moving through the English Channel, they're moving through choke points in the Mediterranean, the Suez Canal. There are lots of points along the route where if you are one of the nations that these vessels are going past, even if that oil's nothing to do with you, you probably want to be confident that those vessels are safe and properly insured. There are a lot of international there are international conventions about free passage, and I think there would be very complex questions of international law about how you would police and intervene to try and ensure or limit that, and I think the Danes have been at the forefront of exploring and testing what is and isn't straightforward to do. I think the other challenge will be a practical one of, if you wanted to do that, who is then responsible, which agency, which resources. You mentioned the Royal Navy's kind of capacity. We are also busy in other places like the Red Sea with the Houthi threat, and there's a lot else going on. But clearly we could, if something terrible does happen, we're all going to regret if we hadn't paid more attention to this, and let something that could have been preventable happen.
Thank you.
Thanks, Keir. And I think just on that point, Angela has a question.
In general, where are these ships flagged? Who owns them? And if as you hint, that they're doing business under the wire 1 minute and then doing legitimate business the next, can't we put a stop to that?
I'll start, and then you may have more to add. The flag and the ownership are very rarely the same. There are certain countries that provide flagging for a lot of the international kind of maritime fleet. There are countries like Liberia, Gabon, and others which end up flagging an awful lot of vessels which have no ownership linked to those territories. A lot of the ownership is also for these relatively opaque. It appears to be companies often registered in countries like the UAE, Indonesia, or elsewhere. Often those are ownership. The ownership changes hands numerous times. The EU has implemented rules to try and limit or monitor the sale of second-hand tankers into this shadow fleet, but there are a lot of vessels that have already entered into it. In terms of that question about our vessels moving back and forwards, I think there's less and less, perhaps in the early days of the price cap, but also that was a period when some Russian oil prices were below the cap levels. So it could have been perfectly legitimate for a European-owned vessel, a European-insured vessel, including the UK here, to have lifted Russian oil, gone through all the attestation processes for the price cap, been allowed to do that, and then for its next cargo maybe lifted oil from the North Sea and brought it to a UK refinery. So that is much less feasible as a behaviour now, because Russian oil prices have been well above the price cap for some time. But I think this is some of the complexity that we have been talking about put into practice, that vessels may have been or may have reason to believe that they were lifting oil legitimately, but often it's portrayed publicly as every vessel, every insurance related to Russian oil is now illegal. That's not how the sanctions have been written, and therefore that's not how industry is currently implementing them.
And I'd say it's a form of sanction that we've never had to deal with before, which has led to some of the complication in terms of implementing it. It's much easier if you say to stop all trade. when you have a halfway house, that's quite difficult to contend with.
Just on the Office for Financial Sanctions implementation, they've been mentioned a few times, and I think, Anne-Marie, you have some more questions on them.
I do. Clearly, the efficacy of what we've now described as OFSI is important to make all of this work, but you've also made it very clear that this is quite complicated and complex, and there's what's legal, what's illegal. So what you need of OFSI is the knowledge and expertise to be able to advise the industry and indeed government to make sure that the sanctions work. Do you believe, for both the energy industry and insurance industry, that OFSI really understands and has the expertise so it can see and spot these breaches and be an efficient body of enforcement? Let's start with energy.
I think we've seen, and I think lots of the evidence presented to the committee has talked about OFSI expanding, adding new recruits, the need for those to build up expertise, and the need for continued investment. I think what we see in the energy industry is OFAC, the US broad equivalent of OFSI, has long been the predominant and the primary sanctions agency around the world, because the US has a much longer history of imposing secondary or broad sanctions linked to the dollar-based financial system. I think OFSI has sensibly been looking at OFAC as a model for how to build up and strengthen itself and the approaches to take. And I think as an industry, we're seeing some of the benefits. So just in the last few weeks, OFSI has started publishing FAQs, explainers that go beyond the kind of initial guidance to actually answer questions that industry is asking and struggling with. I think that's good. I think what we've not yet seen OFSI do as much as OFAC is, and apologies for all the acronyms, we haven't seen as much on the enforcement side. And so if you want efficiency and impact from sanctions, I think enforcement, active monitoring and enforcement against breaches is really important. Sometimes that will be about sanctions designations. So again, late last year, early this year, OFAC in particular was sanctioning a lot of tankers and trading entities involved, it stated, in breaching the price cap using US financial or maritime services. We haven't seen as much of that activity from the UK or from the European Union countries.
Why not? Why do you think that's the case?
I think that part of it will be probably less investigative experience and less sort of history of doing this, but it may also, I think the question is there a political appetite? It's one thing to announce and introduce sanctions, it's a different thing to actually consistently enforce it. And I think even from the US, we haven't seen that consistency of enforcement messaging. We have periods where enforcement is an active focus, and then honestly when oil prices move higher, the messaging appears to shift and suddenly becomes much more about highlighting that, for instance, India can still purchase oil and that's not blocked. I think the other aspect, and I'd just like to highlight that it would really help if OFSI could think about and focus on, is the support and guidance for smaller businesses that don't have compliance teams and functions. I think what we've introduced over the last 2 years is a much broader sweeping range of individual and entity and sectoral sanctions against a country that we have much closer economic ties with than, for instance, Iran or Libya or Venezuela, some of the countries that have been under sanctions for much longer. And I think it's hard enough for big businesses where they have dedicated specialists and they've been competing for that talent, which is limited. But if you think about small exporters, small financial services providers, they really need help if we're expecting them to follow and understand what these sanctions requirements are. And I think that is a role for OFSI and for other bodies linked to the Department of Business and Trade, and I think we now have OFT. But just generally, again, small businesses don't need to worry about which part of government they should be looking to. They really, I think, should be able to get that guidance in a format and in language that makes sense to them.
Any comments as to the impact for your sector, insurance?
So I would agree with the general points that Richard's just made. Our experience of the interaction with OFSI, as I referenced earlier, has been very positive, but there is not a depth of understanding of the insurance industry there and the nuances. The overall implementation and design of sanctions within government is done through a large number of government departments. We now have the trade version of OFSI as well to contend with. And what would be very helpful for the insurance industry, and I would guess a number of other financial services industries, is to have a point of contact that can help us coordinate across government departments. If I look at the work that we did on the Black Sea Grain Initiative and attempting to get legitimate shipments of Ukrainian fertiliser out of the Black Sea, that was a very complex interaction between Business Department, the FCDO, HM Treasury, OFSI. There were a large number of government departments and bodies involved, and having that single coordination point with an understanding of the industry would be hugely helpful.
One of the things that OFSI does is it operates a licensing system, which I think in part you've been referring to. What would be typical activities that would require licenses, and do you think that OFSI gets the balance right to make sure it licenses what it should and not what it shouldn't, and what is the impact of the granting of those licenses on the competitiveness in the sectors? Perhaps we start with you again, Richard.
I think licenses are used in a variety of different ways. We often see them when sanctions are first introduced to cover a wind down. So it's to say, we know we've announced this, you may have existing business ties, you may have contracts, and you need a period of, I use grace kind of in non-legal terms, but a period to exit those relationships before kind of you would be penalised. We sometimes see them to carve out very limited or specific types of activity. I think other panellists have talked about some of the insurance areas. I think we've seen it for, things like provision of household energy utilities to individuals who are sanctioned. So can those companies still receive payments, because the financial sanctions are very broad? But it isn't the intention of the sanctions regime to mean that I don't believe that these people can't have power or water in their houses. So, and then you see it sometimes adding another layer of complexity and nuance to what is the policy intent here. So we have the big overarching, we want to block, and I think the example for energy was financial transactions. Early in 2022, some of the first action was a very, very strong, robust sanctioning of Russian banks, a decoupling from the SWIFT payment system. But general licenses were issued from the US and elsewhere that's carved out and permitted energy transactions. And that said to the market, you can still do those transactions. It complicated them because all the correspondent banks and all the counterparties had to look and say, well, is this covered by the license? Is it not? It adds, and it sent the messaging more complex. So I think licenses have a role, but I don't think they're the answer to everything, and it does add another layer. We've kept coming back to this point, but the more complex you make the sanctions regime, the harder it is even for organisations that want to follow it to understand and navigate. And I think licenses are another part of that picture.
On insurance, any final comments on the licensing piece?
So the licensing piece, I think, exists to manage some of the unintended consequences, and I've made reference to some of the general licenses and the reasons those came into existence. There is also a need to have sometimes the specific licenses. One very niche area I would perhaps point to is for frozen assets, for example, a building, where insurance payouts are necessary for maintenance of the fabric of that building, without which the occupants, who may well not be sanctioned themselves, would not be able to continue to occupy the building, or for literally just keeping the walls and the roof on. So there is that need for licences. My understanding from the market is that where specific licences are being asked for, OFSI is quite slow to respond. I'm unable to say whether that's because of volume of requests or needing a deeper understanding.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I think we've got them to give us evidence in a future session. Siobhan?
Yeah, I mean, as we've been discussing, and Putin's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the UK and other G7 countries froze $300 million worth of Russian state assets. The US just passed a law that will allow them to confiscate those assets held in American banks and transfer them to the Ukraine. And the EU has just passed a law which will allow them to seize the value of the profits from the Russian state assets, not the assets themselves. What effect do you think, above and beyond the ones that you've already described, do you think that the freezing of those assets have, or the seizing the value of the assets have had? Is there any...
I think it's quite challenging for us to say what effect that would have had on the individuals whose assets have been seized. I think you've heard from Mr. Browder what he thinks the effects of those asset seizures were.
And on the insurance market, any effects that you haven't already?
No, nothing that I would draw attention to.
Anything that you feel in the energy sector that haven't yet been raised of the impact?
I think we've seen a little bit of an acceleration of what's called de-dollarization of corners of energy trade. So this is the idea that certain kind of buyers and sellers would choose to transact in currencies other than reserve currencies because of in order to separate themselves and remove themselves from the reach of financial sanctions imposed by the US or G7 countries. For many, many years, there's been a lot of talk about how this might sweep across the oil trade, the energy trade, because many of the countries involved are not close allies of the G7. But I think in practice, we have seen very, very slow movement of that trade because the attractiveness of the dollar and even the euro-based is so strong. The financial networks are so deep and well established. We've seen a little more trade of Russian oil and other commodities moving out of that.
Could you quantify it in some broad percentage?
Not reliably, because so much of this is bilateral trade, so it's not reported and in a format which can be usefully kind of aggregated. So what you get far more is press reports of, but a refinery is discussing, and there are still disagreements because Russia would like this trade to be done in rubles, the buyers would like it to be done in currencies that are more convenient to them. Countries like India and China don't have full convertibility or they don't have the same movement and freedom of currency as reserve currencies do, which is one of the reasons most of this trade is still done in the dollar. But no, I don't have a good number on how much has moved.
And when Sean Keating from RUSI gave evidence to the committee, he said that central banks and the CEOs of major banks should be able to stand up and support the markets if the seizure of Russian state assets had a destabilising effect. Can you tell us about what central banks and major banks can do to support the markets if the government do take action to seize Russian state assets?
I think this is straying a little bit far from my expertise on energy markets, but in terms of energy prices, these probably, given these assets have been frozen for a number of years, it's probably not an immediate threat for energy markets and energy prices.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Siobhan. And Stephen.
Could I just please ask you some questions, very similar to ask Mr. Browder, about differences in regimes and implementation from your two industries' point of view? I also asked him about the misalignment or perceived misalignment between UK, EU and US regimes. Is that a feature of your two industries, or energy and insurance?
Yes. Absolutely, that is a feature. Let me draw out an example related to the oil price cap. In terms of, and forgive me, this is going to go for the technicalities. In the UK, under the oil price cap regime, there is a requirement not only to keep records on a per voyage basis, but also to report to Ofsted all activity under the oil price cap regime. That reporting requirement doesn't exist for US and EU activity, and more broadly in the G7, in the other implementations of the oil price cap regime. So you've got one very clear discrepancy there.
Do they have sanctions clauses inside the insurance, any insurance written in EU and US as well,
Yes,
presumably?
they do. It's so the LMA produced something called LMA 3100, which we've been working on, which is used almost universally, I think, in the insurance industry. So you'll see it in US contracts and EU contracts. And you also have to bear in mind that we'll have insurers from EU, US and UK on the same contract.
So yes, where we get the reporting example is, one obvious one. There's a separate requirement within the oil price cap regime for insurers to be able to provide information. It's costs, insurance and freight information. When it was initially implemented as a requirement, as the oil price cap requirements were adjusted towards the tail end of last year, the original call from the US and the EU was to make that information available within 30 days. The initial implementation in the UK was 28 days. That 2 days might not seem significant, but in terms of when you're operating in a global market, that is an extra compliance burden. It's an extra thing, an extra possible point that you could trip over in terms of your compliance with the oil price cap. I should say that that's now been aligned, and we do now have the 30-day rule universally, but that then required every oil price cap insurance contract that had been written to have an endorsement to allow for the 30 days and not the 28 that was originally written in.
So yeah, we produced clauses based upon the original 28 days. These go into annual contracts, and then you have to change them. It causes quite a lot of disruption in terms of people's understanding of what coverage they've got.
You obviously highlighted the reporting requirement. Is that the major misalignment between regimes at the moment?
I think it's probably the most obvious one. With each and every implementation of sanctions, whether it's oil price cap or otherwise, any discrepancy makes life more complicated. So, for example, European Union sanctions allow for the importation of some oil over land. For example, that's not something that exists in the UK regime. And again, to go back to, these are complicated global contracts for global movements of oil. The more countries, the more regimes are involved, the sharper focus there is on discrepancies.
Anything you'd like to add, Mr. Bruns?
Well, I'd say I think technical discrepancies and inconsistencies exist, and I think they do cause genuine issues. I have been struck that there has been, at a high level, a lot of effort to harmonise and coordinate sanctions. I think that is likely to increase their effectiveness the more that it's done, but there is a risk that the more countries that have a say and have the ability to kind of input, the harder it will be to actually agree robust measures. So one of the challenges the EU has had in formulating its sanctions is it needs unanimity. So one country can block measures that every other member state would approve, and if sanctions are being set at the G7 level, you have that problem again. And I think you have seen differing attitudes and views over the last 2 years and across different countries. So there are carve-outs for very specific flows of Russian energy into Asian countries where they've argued they rely on flows of condensate from Sakhalin-2, or you've seen certain carve-outs in the EU import embargo for certain countries for Russian oil. So it adds complexity, and I think it risks levelling down your ambition politically for sanctions if it has to be a bigger group. But from the industry's point of view, the more harmonisation, the more helpful and straightforward it will be for industry to then follow and implement those rules.
You also shouldn't forget that we keep talking about UK, US and EU, but we've also got Canada, Australia and other jurisdictions that are bringing in their own sanctions in their own ways. So you are trying to match them all up across the various jurisdictions.
But internationally, from what Emma said, there is a unification of insurance contracts now in terms of what you're trying to, in terms of the regime.
In terms of the clauses that are put in contracts to manage sanctions and to make sure that insurance is suspended in the case of sanctions, then yes.
Thank you. And I know Drew touched on it earlier, but are you seeing countries sort of that do not sanction Russia in this way, actively trying to take market share in the insurance sector?
I think the way I'd position it is, if someone is writing insurance for oil or indeed other areas, it must be being written outside of UK.
Which jurisdictions are you seeing taking most of your insurance market share?
I don't have a particular view on which jurisdiction's taking that market share.
Right, Keir.
Great. Just a few questions about sanctions evasion. Emma, are Lloyds of London detecting high levels of sanctions evasion in the insurance market? And then perhaps, Richard, if you could answer the same question, but for the energy sector.
So in terms of Lloyds itself, we oversee the market. So it's the individual managing agents, the brokers, who carry the responsibility for detecting the sanctions. Are we aware of high levels of sanctions evasion? No.
And do those bodies pass up information of when evasion does take place to Lloyds when it does occur?
They would be passing that up to us and sharing that information with us. So no, we do not see it from that perspective.
Okay. And they would have their own individual reporting obligations through to the government.
Sorry, go on.
No.
Okay. And do you have any means at all of quantifying the extent to which evasion might be occurring in the insurance market?
I'd say in terms of what's reported to us, very minimal.
And in the energy sector, Richard?
I think there is quite a lot of sanctions circumvention, so finding those loopholes, those spaces that are beyond the reach of the sanctions that have been set, and there's a lot of energy flows that are moving. There isn't a body which has sort of oversight or visibility of those trades that could offer that. Banks play a role in those transactions, but as we talked about earlier, a lot of that trade has moved out of reserve, or some of that trade has moved out of reserve currencies. I think there is also evasion that goes on. I think it's very hard to put a finger on how much, and most of it is done by organisations that are set up exclusively to smuggle and move oil despite sanctions, and are operating in jurisdictions with very limited kind of rules and oversight for this. And I think where it touches on the Western insurance and services market, often they may be presenting false information to enable that, and that's, I think, one of the goals of the tightening of the price cap rules that took effect in February, was to try and require more information flow. But the difficulty is our sanctions reach is on organisations that are providing insurance or that are only indirectly involved in this trade. The buyers and the sellers are beyond the reach of our mechanisms, and that does complicates and makes it a challenge to judge how much evasion is occurring.
And just back to that point about information flow, the Association of British Insurers told the committee that there are often many layers that separate the customer of the product provider with the ultimate beneficial owner. How do these structures affect the ability to implement sanctions for the sector, would you say?
So the transactions, as the ABI said, have many participants in them, and if you use an oil price cap transaction as an example, your starting point is the exporter and the trader. That's your first level. You've then got the actual entities that are shipping and financing then you've got the insurers, then you've got the reinsurers. So in the language of the oil price cap, that's tier 1, 2, 3A and 3B. That tiering actually can obscure a large number of participants within those layers. So yes, there are a large number of people involved.
And Transparency International also told the committee that because Companies House is prohibited from publishing the names of ultimate beneficial owners of assets, the private sector can find it difficult to implement sanctions. Would it be better if they did publish those names, and would it make your job easier in terms of compliance overall?
So where more visibility of ownership and control would be helpful is in dealing with secondary sanctions. So it's where a sanctioned individual owns an entity with which a transaction is taking place. Mr. Hammond made reference to discrepancies, and we do have a discrepancy there, which is around the UK says, who secondary sanctions apply where the entity is owned or controlled by sanctioned individuals, whereas for the US and the EU, we have a very clear percentage through which to do that. But if part of what we're doing is understanding ownership and control in order to try and implement secondary sanctions, having that clear visibility is doubtless going to help.
And do you think, therefore, it would be good if Companies House published those names, or do you not have a particular view on?
I think going back to my point about stronger compliance from clarity, if individuals and entities are clearly sanctioned and are clearly designated, that strengthens the ability to comply.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, thank you very much. Do any colleagues have any further questions? Then I just really want to invite the panel. Were there any points that you wanted or recommendations that you had for our committee that you haven't had a chance to land in response to our questions? We've covered everything you hoped we would cover.
One thing I just wanted to highlight, and I think if you are taking evidence from OFSI would be interesting to explore, is if you look at particularly the financial penalties associated with enforcement actions, it's been very, very limited associated with the UK system so far. There's been one substantial penalty on a bank, but other than that, we're talking kind of £50,000 or under. If you look at what OFAC has done over the years, much, much higher. So is that a direction that the UK authorities are moving in? Is it just a question of timing and there are investigations underway? Because I think if we're looking from the perspective of the energy markets, they focus far more on what US sanctions say today. And I think some of that is because so much trade relies on the dollar. Yeah. And I think some of that is because there is a widespread acceptance that OFAC sanctions have teeth when they're implemented. So I think it'll be interesting to know, is that a direction of travel for the UK with enforcement?
Thank you. Yes, Arabella.
One other point, actually. I think that this series of sanctions, there's actually been a lot more cooperation between the US, the UK and the EU in terms of how they've been brought in. They have been really complicated. And I'd sort of say if we've got more sanctions coming in, that level of cooperation would be, if they could keep that up and improve it, that would be much appreciated.
I think just to build on Arabella's point, the cooperation is hugely helpful. The strong relationship with UK government and OFSI has also been hugely helpful. What would help us is not only the advanced impact assessments that we referred to in our evidence, but also, where possible, advance warning of designations. That would close the loophole, and it was referred to earlier, where oligarchs can shift their assets off to a family member because they know the sanctions are coming. If we're aware in advance, we can act at an appropriate point before that happens. So advance notice of designation would be helpful.
Right, that concludes our evidence session today. Thank you very much to our witnesses for your evidence. Order.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.